So welcome everybody. Thank you again for being here for our second addition to the Teaching Artists Tuesdays 2023 virtual series. This is Grant Writing and Nonprofit Funding 101 with the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable. We're so grateful to have you all join us. So thank you for making the time. My name is Kinsey Keck. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman with brown hair. It's pulled back in a low ponytail today, but I do have long bangs that touch the top of my big round wire framed glasses that I am wearing. I'm also wearing a sort of brick red-ish pink sweater and a gold necklace. And my background is blurred because I'm sitting in my office and there's quite a lot of stuff going on behind me. So I'm also the programming and membership manager for the Roundtable, which is a grassroots service organization that works to improve and advance the state of arts education through professional development workshops, advocacy, online resources, and other platforms to connect the arts education field. Although we're currently meeting online, the Roundtable would like to acknowledge that we do work and live on unceded lands. Mannahatta, or the place that is also widely known as New York City, exists on the contemporary and ancestral homelands of the Canarsie, Munsee Lenape, and Wappinger people. These sovereign nations and communities are still thriving here, and we continue to occupy their lands. So we would like to give a moment of respect to them, as well as to the Black and immigrant communities who helped build the city that we know today. As we recognize that all of our past, presents, and futures are intertwined, I just want to take one more moment to uplift a few contemporary Indigenous organizations, arts organizations, that we can all support and learn from. So I'm just going to share those in the chat at your leisure. Please take some time to look through those links, get to know these organizations and any others in your area. If you have some that you would like to highlight, we welcome you to share those in the chat as well. I also want to note that this session is being recorded. So about a week after this live session, we'll have this edited and we will send out a link to this recording for you, and you can share it with others that you want to share it with as well. In that email, I'll also include any resources collected during the call. Whew, I think that's it for me. So now I'm really excited to turn it over to our presenter today. Please join me in welcoming Zena Hinds, producer and fundraiser. Welcome, Zena.
Thanks, Kinsey. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be in this virtual space with you. My name is Zena. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white woman with dark brown hair. I'm wearing an olive green top and little silver hoop earrings. This is my third time teaching this for the Roundtable. If I've seen some of you before, it's nice to see you again. And if you're new, I hope that what I want you all to take away from this session today is that while there are like tips and tricks to grant writing, and we're going to go into a lot of those, there's no secret, there's no special training that you need. If you can put words together, as you all can because you're artists, then you can write a grant. And it's just about knowing the specific formatting. So I hope that like we can start from a place of like a little calm, like knowing that we all have what we need to be able to do this. A little bit about me just before I dive in. I was trained as a performer. I fell into doing development and grant writing, and I've been doing that for about the past 6 years. I'm currently working with the Inheritance Project, Tectonic Theater Project, Opening Act, Newport Film, arts education and theater are really my main areas. And I've also worked in like political advocacy and organizing around New York City as well. So the structure of today, like Kinsey said, we only have an hour. I'm going to try to spend about half of that time, little more than half of that time talking, and then half of that time for questions that you all have. The first half of the presentation, I will be talking about where to find opportunities and how to judge if it's a good opportunity for you. I'll pause for about 5 minutes of questions then, and then we'll have a longer chunk of time for questions again at the end. Put your questions in the chat as we go. Kinsey will help feed them to me. You can also save them for when we have specific Q&A time, and we can have a little conversation. And as Kinsey said, the presentation that I'm sharing with you, some of the materials that I'll reference of an extra LOI, we'll go over what that is, will be shared with you afterwards. So you don't need to like write down everything that's on every slide. So let's dive in. I'm going to share my slides, and here we go. Okay. So you already heard me say LOI. That's a term for a letter of inquiry, which just means a way of introducing yourself to a funder. Sometimes this is what funders ask for when they put out a specific request. Sometimes a funder says, we don't take unsolicited applications, but you can send a letter of inquiry. And so that's just a common term that you'll see. I'm not going to go into depth in all of these terms, but the ones that are important is to know that for the most part, what we're going to be talking about is project-specific support. When you're an organization applying for grants, you can be looking more at general operating, but since I'm structuring this session thinking that most of you are going to be seeking out grant opportunities for individuals, and most of the time those opportunities will be for a specific project that you are working on. Sometimes you, as an individual, you might come across a funding opportunity that is a really good fit for you, but says that they only fund 501c3s, nonprofit organizations, or organizations that have fiscal sponsorship. So a few people submitted questions before today's presentation, and I'm going to try to incorporate some of those answers as I go. So there were a lot of questions about what kind of entities can get funding if you're an LLC or a for-profit entity. For the vast majority of cases, these organizations that are making grants can only give those grants to nonprofit organizations, 501c3s, sometimes individuals, or organizations that are fiscally sponsored. If you need fiscal sponsorship, Fractured Atlas has been like the go-to arts fiscal sponsor for a long time, and I have heard good things about them. But any nonprofit can technically serve as a fiscal sponsor, and they're just extending their nonprofit status to you. So if there's an organization that you work with frequently and you find yourself in need of fiscal sponsorship, it may be something that you can find within your own network as well. I called out the government support options that you'll find. In particular, New York State Council on the Arts has started having some grant opportunities that are available for individuals. I would keep an eye on their website through the spring. Probably around March, they will release their next round of grants. And the last thing I want to emphasize is there's like a few different levels of funders, private foundations, public foundations, government funders. They're all run by people. And you, in the same way that you would be like making a connection with a new artistic collaborator, I would encourage you to think of putting together an application for funding as an opportunity to make a new relationship. And if you think about it as a person and not like an opaque entity, that will be helpful in your writing and in how you approach building that relationship beyond just the grant that you're putting together. So how to find grant opportunities. I would really encourage you to look within your own network first. Those are going to be any organizations you work with or artists that are doing similar work to you. You might be surprised to find that you have people in your network who serve on the board of a small foundation, and they have discretionary funds that they can use as a board member, for example. Also, a great place to look is any nonprofit organization usually has a page on their website of like, here's our funders. And that's a great place for you to look for funders that you know are already interested in the same kind of work that you're interested in. And when you're looking to figure out if there's a good fit there, you need to look very carefully at their guidelines, like we talked about, whether they require a 501c3 or a fiscal sponsorship. You need to make sure they make grants to individuals if that's what you're looking for, and also whether there's a particular budget size, like what are their guidelines for funding. Make sure that you're not ineligible before you get too far down, spend too much work on it. And you also want to check the limitations on funding. Some funders say they don't want to fund arts education. The Howard Gilman Foundation is one, for example, where they fund performing arts, but not education. And so again, just like make sure you carefully read that before you decide to apply. And here's some good lists of where to look for those grants. Again, you'll get all this afterwards. These New York City arts organizations, LMCC, Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, Brooklyn Arts Council, all of these arts councils are like sub-funders of the New York State Council on the Arts. And so they have pretty extensive applications because they're a government funder, and those are using taxpayer dollars. So the threshold that they need to meet is just a little higher. But they also have really great materials for applicants to make sure you can understand what they're looking to see from a successful application. I included in the folder that you'll get after this an example from the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, which I think gives you a kind of a great guidelines for what to look for in an application. I'll also call out the MAP fund, MAP fund. They do make grants to individuals and collective artists, and their application also usually opens in the spring. Creative Capital and New York Foundation for the Arts, Art New York, these are all places you can look for funding opportunities. Sometimes they have their own opportunities, and they also are good about listing other upcoming opportunities as well. I would suggest getting on their email lists, and you can get a lot of resources there. On this side, these are websites that you can check into. Some of them do require a certain amount of fee. GrantWatch is the cheapest of the paid options. I wouldn't say you need a paid option to find grant opportunities. I would suggest making a GuideStar account, which is free. And that allows you to say, like, you're on an organization's website, you keep seeing this funder on like multiple websites, but they don't have a website themselves. You can go to GuideStar and see their 990, which is a tax form that they have to submit. And that will tell you at least the names of their staff and the people on their board. And oftentimes there's a list of grants that they've made and on that 990. And so that will give you a sense of whether they would be an aligned funder. And then as you've made a list of like who might be in your network, who's funding similar organizations, and you're trying to narrow it down to what makes sense to apply to. I would encourage you to think of this process as matchmaking. Think about your values and the values that you can find in the organization. These funders, these foundations are pursuing their own mission through their philanthropy. And you want to make sure that the way they want to make change is similar to the way you want to make change? Do they use similar language to you? Um, is there a central question that they want to see applications address, or a specific issue that they're working on? And is it similar to what you're working on? Some funders will talk about a theory of change, and particularly with arts education, you can draw a lot of connections between, um, if it's a more youth development focused foundation, there's a lot of really great data to support arts education as a youth development tool. And so if you decided that that was something that you wanted to apply for, you would just want to make sure that you are putting your application kind of into their language, into their framework. It's not changing what you're doing. It's not making up a new program for the funder, but it's looking at the way that they talk about the work, and making the alignment very, very clear. And then again, as I said earlier, all those funders are run by people. You can go on GuideStar, look at their 990, get the names of all the people on the staff or board, and get a little stalky. Do you know anyone who knows someone that's connected to that foundation? If you can have a conversation with someone before you apply, that will make you so much more likely to write a good application, because you'll be able to understand what they're looking for. And then when you have your application in, they actually will remember that they spoke with you. It'll just get you like that much closer. And it's starting to build a relationship. Even if you don't get funded your first time, they can give you really helpful feedback. They can say, we would love to hear about a future project. And then make sure that you are looking at something that is giving you enough time to submit. If it's like a week away, I would be a little nervous about pulling everything together that quickly. Sometimes there's not an actual deadline. They just say we have rolling applications. If they say they have rolling applications, I would still suggest submitting earlier on in the year, because sometimes they're working on a fiscal year, and if you get towards the end of the year, they will have given away a lot of their pot already. The other thing is that sometimes there's not an open application process. Sometimes they say we don't take unsolicited applications. And in that case, if you still think you're a really strong fit, you shouldn't take that as a no. You should, again, work your network, see if you can find a connection, get a really strong log line of like 2 or 3 sentences about why your project is impactful and aligned with the organization, with the funder, and send an email or send a hard copy letter if that's all you can do. But even if it says no unsolicited, take them seriously. But if you're really convinced that it's a strong alignment, there's like ways around that, and I would encourage you to be bold. That was part 1. I'm going to stop there and take questions for about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back to talk more about grant narratives. So I'm looking at the chat. I love that we have some fiscal sponsorship happening. Does anyone have questions about the process of looking for funders or determining alignment?
Yes.
Go for it.
Just how to, and please pardon me, I came in a little bit late, so I missed a couple of things, but that's where I find I get stuck, is when I have my project pretty much put together, like a good outline, I stop right there. I don't know where to go, like as far as like exactly where am I trying to find this funding, like and who my community resources are, who are my partners. Sometimes I'll have a community partner, but then I'm not exactly sure where the funding is coming from. I've been doing some research locally, like sometimes there are funders in the county or in the state, but then there are lots of others that I just don't know anything about. So I just don't know what I don't know.
Yeah, you don't know what you don't know. I would say start with those partners that you do have, particularly if they're nonprofits themselves, and talk with whoever's running their development. They will have a really good sense of what is in the county that you're working in. See who's funding your partners, because that's often a good place to start, and somewhere where you could have an introduction. So you could start to build that relationship with a program officer there. And so you're not just submitting an application out of thin air, but you've talked to someone at the funder first. And look at any organizations, even if they're not an organization in your network, organizations or people that are doing similar work. Look on their websites for a list of who's funding them, or if you're going to the theater or a dance performance and there's a program that has a list of funders, that is always a good reason to save your programs and look through that. And additionally, in my slides, which you'll get after this, I listed some places that share grant opportunities like Art New York Foundation for the Arts. So you can find things there as well. Aiden, I see your question in the chat about if you're starting a new nonprofit. Government funders, and I'll read it better for everyone, starting a new nonprofit and wondering how much of an established history is required in order to obtain grants. Government funders typically want to see like a 3-year history to be eligible to apply. Sometimes they'll also have a budget threshold to be eligible to apply. But with foundations, it really depends. Again, I know I'm harping on networks. If you can find a foundation that is working with an artist that's part of your new company, they're going to be much more willing to, because there are funders that will get excited about funding something new, especially if you can give them a really strong case for need, like why are you starting a new organization and what's the gap that you're filling. And then also, even though your organization is new, you have a lot of experience. The other artists you're working with on this project have a lot of experience. What is the past experience that you're going to be bringing to prove that this project and your new organization is going to be successful? So you're going to get you're going to get a lot further with those foundations and places that you can actually develop a relationship to have a conversation with them about your new organization. Is that helpful?
Very much so. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Great. Okay, I'm going to take this last question from the chat and then go back into the slides. So job applications. Yes, not to do cold calls. That is something that I think a lot of us have heard culturally. I also hesitate to make cold calls, but it's something that I've had to get over through years in development because it's expected to a certain extent when you're fundraising from individuals, when you're calling a foundation. Sometimes the only way to get in front of someone is actually getting them on the phone. And I can tell you from experience that there are plenty of times where I've gotten someone on the phone, even when I've emailed them like 3 times and not gotten any answer. I've gotten them on the phone, and then we're actually able to start talking because people just kind of screen their emails and they don't really look. And so it is hard. Cold calls are difficult, but it is worth it. Again, if you really feel like there's a strong alignment, don't just do it for anyone, be selective. But if you have a foundation that's funding 3 of your friends, 3 similar projects, you know that should be an interest there. You can call and you can be really respectful on the phone. And if you're nervous about making cold calls, practice it with someone. But it's not like, especially in the industry of fundraising, it's pretty standard. So that's what I would say to ratchet down the ante on cold calls. All right. So in terms of applying for grants, I'm going to focus mostly on narratives. The full part of the full pieces of an application would be a narrative, a budget, and supplemental materials. I'll touch briefly on the last 2, but the bulk of your application is going to be a narrative. Sometimes you will have an application form that has very specific questions, and sometimes you'll be writing an LOI, like we talked about, where it's 2 to 3 pages, pretty unstructured. But the points that you want to hit in each case are similar. You want to talk about your history and your mission, and if you're an artist applying for something as an individual, that would be your artistic vision. Why are you called to do this? Don't be afraid to brag, tell your story, and what motivates you. And this is also where I would look at tweaking your language slightly. If you have a foundation that's talking about social emotional learning, and you usually talk about your arts projects as something else happening in the classroom, it's pretty easy to just like work those words that the funder is using in a way that subliminally says to them, like, hey, I get it, I get what you're doing, and we're aligned. The statement of need, or why now, what is the problem that you're trying to address, and why is it still a problem? You can also talk about it when you're applying for something as an individual. How is this project furthering your artistic practice? What is it helping the audience with? What is it helping your community with? And then for those more left-brained people, if you can find data that will support the outcomes you're looking for, that is always nice to include, like a line about, there have been all these studies about the impact of arts education. The Roundtable has helpful resources to start you off on that. You can also use like Google Scholar, but there's plenty of places to like back up the impact that we all know the arts has. But sometimes when you're applying to a funder that's a little more like cut and dry, they want to see more of that sort of like research evidence-based, and you can find ways to include that. And then a big piece of your application is going to be just describing what the project is. Make sure you're clear about all the W questions: who, what, where, when, why. Make sure to include a timeline, saying that, like, and some of it may seem very obvious, like we're gonna rehearse and then we're gonna tech and then there will be a show, but breaking it down for the funder about like, how long are you rehearsing? Why are you rehearsing for that length of time? Or if it's an arts project, what is the final product that students are making? Is there going to be a presentation? How many presentations? Where is it going to be? Is there going to be an audience invited? Make sure to just put all those details in there. And don't be afraid to brag about what's special about your project. Why are you the best organization or the best artist to be doing this? What in your history will inform your approach to this project? And also talking about your population that you want to serve. Again, this might seem fairly obvious if you're writing something for an arts education program and it's in high school. Just make sure you're articulating high school, grades 9 through 12. in Brooklyn, in the Bronx, in Manhattan, whatever it may be, because putting it that simply will help your funder kind of check their boxes. And then we're going to talk more about specific outcomes and evaluation methods. I think that's actually next. Yes. One thing I'll say before we go to outcomes and evaluation methods, when you're starting to write this narrative, make sure that you've read the guidelines really closely and the instructions. If there are any, a lot of the time, if you have specific, if the application is broken down into questions, each question will have a character limit or a word count, and make sure that you're incorporating that into how you're working. I would suggest making, if it's an online application form, look at the form, make a working doc outside of that online application, either in Google Docs or Word or whatever you use as your word processor. Make sure you're including what the word counts are for yourself as you work, but then you don't have to worry about your work getting lost on the internet application form.
Hey, Zena,
make sure,
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I was just wondering if you're moving through slides because you stopped your screen share and didn't restart it. So I don't know if you're moving through slides or not, but if you are, we can't see them.
I was, but that's okay. Let me go back to screen sharing. Okay. Everything that I was just saying is outlined here. Thank you for calling that out, Kinsey. And so when you're thinking about writing this narrative, you make your working doc outside of the application. Make sure that you understand, like, how I approach writing these things is like, make yourself bullet points, make an outline, like when you were in school writing an essay. Think about what the key points are that you need to include. Write all those out, and then you can play around with the puzzle and figure out where they need to go and add more language. But you want to make sure you have the key points so that someone can understand what your project is and why you're doing it. I'm going to say this again later on, but just remember that you're writing this for someone that doesn't know your project, may not be an artist themselves. So you need to take the time to explain some of the things that we might take for granted of, like, why are the arts important? You might need to spell that out a little more for them. And that's when you can get really passionate and really sell what your project is, because it has these great outcomes that will help the community that you're working with. So outcomes and evaluations. This is something that is very specific to, like, grants, and funders really want to know, like, how will you know that the project is successful? They want to know that the money they've spent or they've given to you has had a measurable and successful outcome. And so you need to tell them ahead of time, what are you going to be tracking to determine success? And those can be both qualitative and quantitative. Quantitatively, the number of performances, how many students you're going to have, or how many audience members, whether there's, if you can have a follow-up survey, and you're able to show, like, how many people report a specific change that you would be looking for. But then you can also collect qualitative stories of how how students responded to the work. If you have that survey, you can have open-ended questions to collect quotes, and that's also really valuable. I would encourage you to think about in your project, like, what are the evaluation methods that you're going to use? Are you able to send out a survey afterwards using SurveyMonkey, or on the last day of class, is it going to be a written survey? Are you able to do follow-up interviews with a handful of the participants? And then we talked about data earlier. If you can find something that supports your project achieving those outcomes and says like, this is something that has been proven before, that is also a helpful case to make. And then probably a lot of people have heard of SMART goals. This is a helpful sort of guideline as you build what those outcomes you want are. And my favorite tip here is also, once you figure out what it is that you're going to do, you can pad it with a lot of discussion of how important evaluation is to you, and you really value it, and it's going to inform the continued project in XYZ way. And that just kind of helps to sell it, especially if you feel like oftentimes the evaluation is something that you need to do for the funding. And it might be a little short otherwise. You can just talk about how great evaluation is, and also like, and then here's the little things we're going to do, and it'll come out sounding good. When you're writing a narrative, there's some examples included in the folder that are going to be sent to you. You want to think about both these kinds of people reading it, both left-brain people and right-brain people. So you can go back and forth between talking about your artistic vision, the emotional impact this will have on participants, the way that it's tying communities together. And then you can also switch to this left brain side and talk about, that's where more of the data comes in. We've seen these studies, or in my past experience, I've been able to see this change. And because you don't know exactly who's going to be reading your application, and you want to be able to speak to all of those kinds of people. More tips are, don't be afraid to brag about yourself. This is your company. This is you as an artist. This is anyone that's going to be working on your project with you. If you've received awards or grants before, if you've received a previous grant, that's great to mention, either from this organization or from a different funder, to be able to say like, hey, other people have invested in me before. If you're able to talk about a previous project that was similar, or offer testimonials from a previous project, that is really valuable. You want to make it easy for the funder to say yes to you. Use the language that they use. Really spell out what the alignment is. Like, it can be as blunt as the mission of XYZ organization is to improve the quality of life for young people in New York City. My project will do that by da 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 da. Like really, really straightforward. And then once you've built out your structure, think about, this is like kind of when you're going through your second or third pass, think about how you're guiding the reader through the narrative. Sometimes people will be reading a lot of applications and they might be skimming. Make sure your first sentences are really strong, because if someone is skimming, the first sentence of the paragraph is going to be like what they pick up first. Bold things that are important. If you're creating a list, like, you can use a couple bullet points to break up the flow and kind of help the person reading absorb. And of course, you always want to have a strong opening that says what you're seeking funding for and why, and a strong closing. And the closing can like pull on the heartstrings a little bit, talk to that right brain. And as I said, put your ask at the top. If there's not a specific amount of funding that is defined, you can ask at the top for like, I'm respectfully requesting a grant of $10,000 for this project, and say it right at the beginning. Oh, I feel like there was another tip I had and I've lost it, but that's okay. So this is like wrapping up what I've talked about with the narrative. I think these all will sound familiar at this point. The last thing is making sure your narrative is compatible with your budget. We're not going to fully talk about the budget, but what I mean by that is if you have to submit numbers, make sure that if your budget is including a line for photography, that you've mentioned in your narrative why it is important to have a photographer and to document the work. Or if your narrative talks about photography, but it's not in your budget, that doesn't work either. So you need to make sure that those two things reflect each other. I think what I forgot that I wanted to mention is when you have that narrative and you're doing multiple drafts and rereading and refining, ideally get someone who is unfamiliar with your project to read it and give you feedback, because they'll be able to tell you if you're using insidery language or if you are taking something for granted that actually they don't understand. So those are going to be like your best friends who maybe aren't even artists. See what points confuse them, because that will give you the best information on where you can further clarify your narrative. So we're not going to fully go over budget, but you will be able to read this. And supplemental materials are often funders require them. Sometimes they're optional. If they're optional, I would still suggest including them because this can show, not tell. It can give your story visually. Photos or videos, it can be from past projects. If you have press coverage of your project or a previous project, a lot of the time with an arts education project, you will want to submit a lesson plan or a curriculum overview. If you have work samples from yourself as the primary artist or the other primary artist that will be working. And those evaluations that we talked about, if you have a survey that you know you're going to be using at the end, you can also submit that as a supplemental material. I'm going to take a drink of water, 1 second. Okay. Last thing on supplemental materials is to provide some context for them if you're able to. And by that, I mean, if you're giving them a link to a video, say 2 sentences about like, this is a video from this past project. It is relevant to the application I'm submitting because it has these same artists or it was with this same school. Just make sure to explain it a little bit more. This is what we talked about. Proofread, ask your friends to proofread, make sure your budget numbers add up. The budget should ideally be able to like tell the story of your project if someone looked at that first and then looked at the narrative, and make sure everything fits together and is all telling the same story. Double check the submission guidelines, make sure you're in the correct format, and then put it all together and submit. I'm not going to go over this part today, but you can look through it. And now we have time for more questions. Cool. I'm looking at the chat. So the first question I see in the chat is, how do you address target audience without making it sound that you are leaving other people behind? Can you tell me, do you have a specific project in mind for that question? Teaching, okay, teaching female adults. I think you can describe that population, talking about why specifically you want to work with them. So it's not as much about who you're leaving out, but why is it important that it's this group together? Okay. Rin, how do you approach a new project that doesn't have all the details set? Great question. How do you provide flexibility? So you can, it is perfectly okay to write into a narrative where you are still figuring something out. You can always use words like potential partners and anticipated final product. You can say it'll either be this or this. Here's how we'll decide. Because that piece of like, here's how we'll decide gives them the context to understand that you are thinking about it. And that you know, like, sorry, 1 second. Okay. A lot of talking and probably not enough vocal support. But yeah, explaining how you will choose the parts of your project that are not fully defined yet will give the funder the confidence. Like you want to say like, look, I am thinking about this. It's all good. I got it under control. Even if I'm still picking between different options. You had a few questions in there, but let me know if I didn't answer all of them. Any books that I'd recommend on grant writing? I don't think I've ever read a grant writing book, to be honest. But if I come across one, I'll give it to Kinsey to send out. Measurable objectives. Yes, I can discuss a bit about measurable objectives. That is often going to be like how many engagements you're going to have with your target audience. So if you're going to have one workshop a week for a 10-week semester, that's a measurable objective. How many students? And then it'll often also be a matter of what you're able to include as a survey measurement, or even like a final conversation with the class, that you can say like, you want to see X self-reported change in students. You want to see students that say they feel more connected to their peers. And that's a question on the survey that you're able to give at the end of class. You can say you want to see 80% of students reporting that they feel closer to their peers, and that is a measurable objective. Gretchen, question about whether it's okay to include links within the application. My answer is like, it depends. Sometimes those online application forms, the text boxes are not actually formatted to allow hyperlinks. So I would not take for granted that you could include a link. If you're sending a PDF and it has a link that you can include, great. But I would also not take for granted that whoever's looking at your grant is going to click the link. So if there's a link you want to include in your narrative, I would suggest including it in a way that, like, in your narrative, you're saying the most important thing from it that you would want them to get. But if they click the link, then they get even more. But make sure they can get it all in the narrative if they need to. How do you address paying yourself within a grant application? Yes, that is something I talk about when I talk about the budget. You should definitely be paying yourself. If there is a funder who, I don't think I've seen many funders say this, but like, they don't want to support fees for whatever, or they don't want to support salaries, I would say they're a bad funder and don't work with them, because you are a part of the project. You are at a very important part of the project. So a particular percentage, it shouldn't go over in terms of the overall budget. I would say there's not a standard. You will need to look at the funders, because some will have guidelines about they don't want to pay for more than 50%, or it's okay for you to include $10,000 of staffing but they'll only pay for 2,000. And sometimes you'll be developing a budget that shows here's what you're paying for and here's what the rest of the project is. So if there's no specific guidelines, I would say a lot of your project budget is going to be paying for people in this kind of work. Like a lot of the time you're in a classroom that's been provided in kind. There's only so many materials costs. You're the ones providing the expertise. So make sure you're thinking about the other kinds of costs that you can include that aren't personnel, but personnel are going to be a big part of your budget, and that is okay. Again, align your budget with your narrative. Explain who the personnel are in your budget. If it's 6 teaching artists, 12 teaching artists, give a little context for who they are, why they're great for the project. If it's you and you as the artistic director and another co-artistic director, executive director, just to explain why those people are important to the project. I'm reading this question from Valerie. Sent an application that was a PDF and entered the allowable number of words. I cannot scroll down in one of the fields to see the context. I'm not sure I'm totally understanding if there's a question in there, Valerie, but if you see anything funky as you're submitting an application and you're worried that it's not going to display the way you want, it's definitely worth taking the time to make sure that you shift things around. And that's also why I would strongly suggest don't submit a grant the day it's due. Like go in and try to do it the day before, because if you run into anything weird and you might need to shift something, you're not going to be scrambling at the last second. A lot of the time also, some funders will offer feedback if you send them your narrative much further in advance of the deadline. But look for those opportunities to take advantage of. MAP Fund is one of them that will give you feedback on your narrative, but you have to send it pretty far in advance of the deadline. But that's something to keep in mind. Valerie, go ahead.
Oh, yes. Thanks for talking about my comment. It wasn't a question, it was just an experience I had recently, and it was related to what you were saying about the PDFs. So I wanted to thank you for that. And then also about submitting on the actual deadline. I have found sometimes, and some of the grantors will talk about this, that the system can crash if so many people are submitting at once. And so that's kind of another reason to submit in advance of the deadline.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not something to procrastinate on. And if you are a procrastinator, maybe like lie to yourself. Tell yourself the deadline is 2 days before it actually is, and forget the real deadline. There was a question that we got before, as you were signing up for this event, about someone asked, what is the biggest mistake you see when people are starting out in grant writing? And one thing I would say is that, like, don't count yourself out before you even apply for something. I know I've talked a lot about alignment and making sure that your project makes sense with the funder. But I think we've all seen those studies about, in particular, like women being unlikely to apply for a job if they don't hit 80% of what's on the job posting. And I think that applies for grants too. Like, if you have, this is more about like, how much time do you have to spend on this? And if you have the time to put together an application and you think there's enough of a case there, don't talk yourself out of it. Like, try to make the connection, write the application, you should go for it. The other mistake I would say I see is like, when people write something that clearly they didn't have someone outside of their project read it, and so it's using a lot of insidery language, and there's just pieces missing where like someone who's not involved in that project or not as engaged in the arts might not be able to understand it in the way that you would want them to. Great.
Zena, Asma also shared in the chat, and Asma, I invite you if you want to come off of mute to share a little bit more about your question. But she mentioned like wanting to celebrate older adults, feeling not included, but not wanting to exclude. That might tie into that earlier question we had about like, how do I write something about a population and not make folks feel excluded? So Asma, if I didn't do your question justice, please help.
I think you did my question justice, but I've also been a teaching artist who applied for many years for grants. And it always felt it was a question of the in crowd. And now I'm an older adult and I sit in rooms where people are like, wow, you know everybody, but don't get grants.
Yeah, definitely what we don't have time to go into is the problems of philanthropy and the way it is, and it can be an in crowd. And a lot of what I've talked about is like trying to find ways to get around that of, you know, you might not be on a board where you are liaising with like all these different funders, but if you can find a director of development and organization that you work with that can make those connections, help you make those connections. Find the people in your network that don't approach philanthropy with a scarcity mindset, and that approach philanthropy with a wealth mindset and with a community mindset, and use them to help you make connections and help them make connections, because that's part of the community aspect. Some aspects of philanthropy are moving more towards a community centered model, and some foundations are doing better than others, but it's going to be a slow process in some corners. Well, I think that's our time, and I'm going to hand it back to Kinsey to close. But what I'll say is you'll get the materials after, and if you think of any questions after the fact, which is something that I always do, please feel welcome to email me. I'll put my email in the chat. I want everyone to get the money they need for their projects and to be able to support your lives. So thank you all for the great work that you are doing.
Thank you, Zena. Thank you so much. I know we only had an hour, but I really appreciate how much you were able to cover with us, and that you were able to answer everyone's questions, which so rarely happens. So thank you so much for taking the time.